Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Uh, I want to say something here before I go into what I really want to talk about, but I guess I really want to talk about this though, since I want to talk about it. So, anyway, hope you're doing well. I'm amazed at the world out there, how people over identify with their political views, and particularly politicians like the president. People disagree with me all the time and they hate on me. That's okay. Go for it. I'm not going to own it, but go ahead. I guess I'm used to that. Living where I live and the things that I say. But I respect others if they're completely different. But I'm just amazed at how when something is said about the president and someone's very supportive of them, they take it so personally. Oh my. It's like, and particularly people who say they're Christ followers. I just want you to breathe and try to seek that identity in Christ. I don't know. Maybe think about doing that rather than try to defend someone who really is indefensible. But I know I just upset you by saying that. But the president's fine. You don't need to defend him. But people so over identify with him that they take it so personally if you don't agree with them. Just breathe. And maybe breathe in that spirit of love and the spirit of Christ. And maybe that'll help. But I'm certainly not telling you what to do. I'm just suggesting it possibly. Because you have to know social media isn't going to change anyone's mind. All right? Right? Seriously. People are just going to listen to the things they want to believe in and reaffirm whatever they're so focused on. Okay, here we go. Got that out of my system. Of the 12 federal holidays that we have, there are three that lift up individuals. The birthday of George Washington, the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and then there's this Columbus Day, Christopher Columbus. That was just celebrated earlier this week. Kind of peculiar, to say the least. I want to talk about that because unlike the first president of the nation and the 20th century civil rights leader, Christopher Columbus has only really a tenuous connection to what became the United States. I mean, Lordy be. Although many of us erroneously were taught that Columbus discovered America, and I was when I was in grade school, the man never set foot on soil within our national borders. Okay? Never did. And famously did not even comprehend that he had encountered lands unknown to the Europeans until his third voyage in 1498. But by tethering their story to Columbus, early leaders of the United States magically endowed the fledgling nation with a 300-year pedigree. A Genesis story whose in the beginning implied its birth was the outworking of providence, of divine providence, that the hand of God was involved in all of this. And they invented a past that gave their present holdings of the land and their rapacious ambitions kind of the veneer of divine inevitability. The sweeping power of this narrative strategy, however, lay not in the epic voyages, not just in the epic voyages of Columbus, but in the religious doctrine he relied upon and really helped to crystallize. And that was the Christian doctrine of discovery. As Spain and Portugal ramped up their exploration and colonization efforts in the latter half of the 15th century, the self-described Christian kings and queens sought a moral mandate that would simultaneously address their obligations, to newly discovered peoples and mitigate bloodshed among themselves. They ended up turning to the closest thing they had to international law back then, and that was the Roman Catholic Church. In a series of proclamations put forth by the Pope, the papal proclamations between 1452 and 1493, a new theology crystallized for the New World. While the theological constructions of the doctrine of discovery were complex, their logic was pretty straightforward. And here it is, kind of sort of in a nutshell. You can look it up and whatever. The principal question for Europeans determining whether any newly discovered peoples had human rights was the question, are they Christian? Are they Christian? If the answer was negative, the indigenous people were categorized as enemies of Christ, whose lands were then subject to occupation and whose goods were subject to confiscation. If indigenous people resisted the imposition of European authority, the new arrivals carried the permission of the crown and the blessing of the church to reduce those indigenous people, words actually say, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, or to kill those indigenous people outright. Most of the controversy around the celebration of Columbus Day in the U.S. has focused on Columbus's barbaric treatment of indigenous people. Lionizing Columbus implicitly celebrates something much more systemic and appalling, that the moral compass for the world should be European Christian supremacy. This moral and religious orientation gave European colonists the right to undertake the genocide and the forced removal of indigenous people from their lands, and in latter years, the subsequent kidnapping, and enslavement of Africans to transform those lands into profit-producing plantations. That is the foundation upon which this nation and its economy was built upon. The genocide of the indigenous people, the taking of their land, and the forced enslavement of Africans. There is now a 3 decades long movement in our nation, initially led by indigenous people, to replace the celebration of Columbus with a day honoring the indigenous inhabitants, the original inhabitants of these lands. Indigenous Peoples Day was first celebrated in Berkeley, California in 1992 on the 500th anniversary of the arrival of Columbus to the Americas. Since then, more than a dozen states and 130 cities have adopted the holiday. In 2021, President Joe Biden became the first sitting president to issue an official proclamation of Indigenous Peoples Day. We need to understand that today, only 42% of Americans identify as white and Christian. It's not a majority, okay? There must be a cultural reckoning with the legacy of racism in our nation's history and a replacing of Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Such a shift would represent a meaningful step forward. I do believe that. Columbus Day inevitably celebrates the European colonizer and a religious worldview that validated and authorized the violence unleashed upon the indigenous people of this land. To have an Indigenous Peoples Day, I believe, points Americans forward toward higher principles. As President Biden said in his 2021 Indigenous Peoples Day proclamation, our country was conceived on a promise of equality and opportunity for all people. A promise that, despite the extraordinary progress we have made through the years, we have never fully lived up to that. That is especially true when it comes to upholding the rights and the dignity of the indigenous people who were here long before colonization of the Americas began. A federally recognized Indigenous Peoples Day would simply be the right thing to do, to honor our full history, our demographic present, and our democratic aspirations. But there's another more urgent reason we should embrace this change. The anti-democratic orientation of the doctrine of discovery still lives among us today. Boy, do we see it playing out. More than 5 centuries after its emergence, 30% of Americans, including majorities of Republicans and white evangelical Protestants, agree with its central tenet that, quote unquote here, America was intended by God to be a promised land where European Christians could set an example for the rest of the world. This, I know I'm bad with eye rolls, I'm sorry. This increasingly militant minority of white Christian nationalism has its roots reaching back into that Christian doctrine of discovery that was in place in Europe well before the founding of our republic. Our nation never has fully answered this question. Are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians, or are we a pluralistic democracy where everyone, regardless of race or religion, stands on equal footing as citizens? If we are to finally embrace our identity as a pluralistic democracy, we can't abide an ongoing Columbus celebration of a world view that erodes that commitment. Okay? But if instead we can just pause each year to honor indigenous people alongside George Washington and Martin Luther King Jr., that observance will reorient us to the ongoing work of achieving the yet unfulfilled promise of our democracy. God bless you. Peace be with you. Love you.